We talked about the history and the design and the philosophy of the Silicon Valley philanthropy. And the question that I think many of us are thinking is, then what should we do about this? And what should we do to make a better ecosystem on giving? And the reason why at the Asan Foundation, co-conducted this lecture is that because of the belief that impact grows when people with different strengths, like entrepreneurs, startups, and nonprofit leaders, come together as two partners, it will make something different. So this session focuses on how nonprofits can build stronger long-term relationships with entrepreneur donors, creating collaboration that are both respectful and result-oriented. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Vera Mikulczyk, who leads the Stanford PACS Effective Philanthropy Learning Initiative and brings practical tools for designing these kind of partnerships. So Dr. Mikulczyk, the floor is all yours.
I missed the very beginning of what Micah was saying, and I just want to be sure that you all know our organization. You know what it is, the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, which does research on philanthropy, civil society, and social innovation. And we very much care about building pipeline of scholars and practitioners who are informed by the research we do. And ultimately, as Micah was describing, we care a lot about the very thing he said we need more of, and that is effective philanthropic practice in the world. And I just want to emphasize that the talk Micah gave for all his modesty is really a reflection of knowing a heck of a lot about the history of philanthropy generally, and certainly philanthropy in the Silicon Valley, and being able to really tease out some critical themes and ideas, which in his delivery may seem really obvious, but they're not. It's just the smoothness of his thinking and the clarity of his thinking that make it feel very smooth. So I really want to say, it's a gift to have a scholar like him present, but also it sets up a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about in this session. And I hope we have time to answer questions at the end that relate to both of the conversations, actually, both of the presentations. I just want to highlight that we also published the Stanford Social Innovation Review, which is maybe the preeminent journal on, it's not an academic journal per se, but it's very strongly informed by the scholarship of many of the editors. And there's a Korean version, also a lot of content about Korea. And I think having a Korean language version may not be something that has been mentioned. And those are sort of my introductory comments about who we are and what we do besides the content of this particular conversation. The content of this particular conversation, as I was just alluding to, really focuses on some of the practical tools, practical values, practical ideas that I think shape relational work between donors and the nonprofit sector generally, what constitutes civil society. And I'm going to go through a few critical points that I think do resonate with what Micah was saying about maybe trust-based philanthropy, participatory philanthropy, flavors of philanthropy that include the contributory work that we saw in the beginning of the last century with Carnegie and Rockefeller and others, and then also stand in kind of opposition to the disruptive version, because I think a lot of what Micah was indicating was that disruptive philanthropic vision and some of the ways in which it's been practiced is not as much about relationships. I will focus on, I think, three critical areas that are related. One is alignment and what it means to build alignment between donors and the nonprofits that actually enact their vision typically, and the beneficiaries that may represent a community that the donor cares about. And then one of my focal areas in how I think about this work is really what are the knowledges, what are the kinds of knowledge, the genesis or points of origin of this knowledge, and how that knowledge lives in both the practice of philanthropy, but also kind of a vision of understanding the social world more broadly and how that can inform what happens in the civil society sector. And then we've talked a bit about outcomes and measurement, and it's such a huge topic. We can't say a lot in this conversation, but I'd like to, offer a few thoughts in that area. And then maybe we'll talk about some leverage points of working with donors, thinking about the position of donors and how they think about their work as contributing to civil society, to social change. Yeah, the topic that we have that we're working with together, what does it take for nonprofits and donors to build meaningful, enduring relationships, especially when donors are entrepreneurial, fast-moving, and values-driven? That's kind of the framing question that you probably saw in the blurb that introduced this talk. What does it take to build meaningful, enduring relationships? And the assumptions about donors that parallels the question about building meaningful, enduring relationships is that donors are values-driven, which absolutely is the case. I think everybody's values-driven, and especially people who are thinking about their role in society, their relationship to society. We got a lot of that about Andreessen and Zuckerberg and Thiel and Musk in the last presentation. Certainly, they all have values that any of us may or may not agree with, but that in addition to that, almost by definition, not necessarily, but almost by definition, a lot of philanthropic leads, a lot of people who have made vast sums of money are entrepreneurial. They've taken risks. They've thought about what is missing in the social sector and in the business sector, in the market typically, and they've invested time, money, often their life savings to start something that has often become very big. And I don't think any of the Silicon Valley mega donors that we've discussed came from great wealth. I think they've certainly had supports and been prompted by or propped up by social resources and family resources, but they've largely created vast amounts of wealth. And I think even though we see generational wealth, people who have inherited money as a significant force in the civil society sector, and certainly among philanthropists, entrepreneurship is a driver of great wealth, and wealth that could be and often is really significant in philanthropy and in the philanthropic sector right now. And then the third point in the framing question, what does it take to build relationships, is that they move fast. And yes, that's true. A lot of donors do move fast. The old saying in the Silicon Valley that you might have heard, move fast and break things, be disruptive, be entrepreneurial in to such extent that you're not worrying about sustaining existing systems, but you're willing to completely undermine existing systems, the taxi system for the Uber and Lyfts of the world, or the and there are thousands of examples that you can think of where technology made an existing socio-technological system obsolete almost overnight. I mean, that is part of the ethos, but there are counter movements as well. Move slowly and fix things. And one thing that I think may characterize current thinking about philanthropy is move fast and fix things. So you can't be you can't be too slow, and you can't be too worried about getting every detail correct. We need to try things, and we need to be implementing in ways that test what might fix the system. And so that's just a set of assumptions that I think this conversation is operating with, that yes, people move fast, but maybe there are times to move slowly if your ultimate goal is to fix things or to make a system better, to make the world a better place. And when we talk about love of humanity as the foundation of philanthropic practice, philanthropic goals, and giving philanthropic aspirations, excuse me, for me, the late night hour or the early morning hour makes my mouth very dry, so I'm going to just take a sip. The idea that ultimately the goal is to fix things, whether it's by making an existing system better or by changing the system, is really at the heart of the philanthropic impulse. Arguably with different kinds of approaches. Micah was just describing effective altruism as just saving lives, through vaccines, through bed nets, thinking about the return on investment in money. How many lives do you save versus something that that like the Carnegie libraries that creates a different quality of life for many people, but really changes the cultural landscape that we operate in as humans who are so much more than just being alive. We're investing in matters of the spirit, matters of the mind, matters of our social relations in ways that go beyond the merely being alive. And I think that's an interesting tension in the philanthropic space right now. There's a lot of literature. There's, gosh, no end of it on what makes a relationship work, including in partnerships of professionals, in partnerships that could be researchers and practitioners, in partnerships that can be two different market-oriented entities that have different roles in that space, and certainly between a donor and a grantee or a nonprofit enacting a certain vision, and certainly the beneficiaries or communities or constituents that would benefit from a donor's giving. So I'm not going to do a long list of such things, but I do think it's important to note that throughout the literature on what makes a relationship of kind of a professional organizational matching kind of connection, what makes that kind of relationship work, there are things that I think are quite important, and certainly one is commonality of values, of assumptions, and of goals, vision, commonality in the space that the two organizations or multiple organizations wish to work in, a collaborative sensibility where they are willing to roll up their sleeves and try things together. Mutual respect is critical. The organizations have to appreciate the space in which each of them is working and be committed to continuing to respect the differences they may have and the goals that each have, the efforts that each are putting into their work. Trust is a big one, and we hear about that a lot, and we were just talking about trust-based philanthropy, but many will argue that trust is built from these other things, from these strong relationships. And for me, one of my favorite words in the space is mutuality, that there needs to be a sense that they're in it together, they depend on one another, do what it takes to create mutual benefit and then mutually arrived at outcomes. Mutuality can mean mutual engagement, mutual participation, and I think when we talk about participatory modes of philanthropy that Micah have mentioned has come out of a lot of the pushback against some of the less mutualistic spirit in the Silicon Valley, that the participatory movement in philanthropy means mutual participation of various sorts. And there's also a strong emphasis on co-creation, co-design, and I think that a lot of things is at the heart of relationship building. Co-creation being something that many donors are increasingly willing to allow into their thinking about changing the world. And I don't think co-creation was at the top of mind for Carnegie and Rockefeller. I don't think it was at the top of mind for a lot of donors in the 90s and aughts, but I do think it's increasingly so. And I'm lucky to be part of some of the work that the Gates Foundation is funding right now in the field of education. That is a strong reaction to the failure of some of their very top-down initiatives in the 80s, 90s, and aughts, and now is really far from the way they operate. They're trying much, much more deliberately to rely on research, rely on many types of knowledge, and to build co-design, co-creative ways of operating in the world. So I've lived a lot of the things that Micah has talked about in terms of the back and forth and the kind of the whiplash that comes from different flavors or trends. Certainly, you know, when we talked about what happened in Newark, New Jersey, with Mark Zuckerberg's investments, many of the top-down initiatives of the Gates Foundation in education, small schools, teacher added value, you know, a few other things were proven by some of the work my colleagues had done to really not be achieving their goals. And in addition to Zuckerberg failing with his $100 million investment in the Newark schools, Bill Gates admitted that his $500 million investment in some of these top-down educational programs really didn't deliver on the things that they said they would deliver. You know, focus on test scores and focus on standardizing across curricula, and many other things failed because they didn't take into account local context, because they didn't listen to beneficiaries, listen to grantees, because they made assumptions that there were simple fixes, and they relied on the intuition of a big donor who thought that they knew how to fix things maybe through market mechanisms rather than through other more community derived means, more ways that reflected really an understanding and a deep understanding of context and of the experience of people in the field, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. So, all of that said, I'd like to move to what I said is important, and that's alignment. And I'd say that when I talk about alignment, I think I want to emphasize stages of alignment between a donor and a grantee, between funders and beneficiaries, funders and communities, funders and constituents. The first stage of alignment, well, the very first stage, I think, is stage 0, is values. Values have to be shared for people to move into the same space. And I think values are very vague and general. And I think if a funder is looking for a nonprofit to work with, they sort of, my assumption is there's some a priori or some you know, sort of very foundational shared set of values, and they translate into something more concrete, which is goals. And we teach a class, Micah and I teach a class with Stanford undergraduates that's focused on sustainability and sustainable development. It's affiliated with the New School of Sustainability at Stanford, which was funded, you know, with over $1 billion of donor giving to really see that, you know, basically the SDGs, the kinds of goals that are articulated with the SDGs are realized, although time is running out, as most people who are measuring them will say. But we tell the undergrads that they can pick a philanthropic area to investigate that as long as it fits within the SDGs, and everything fits within that space pretty much. You know, there's almost nothing you could come up with that doesn't. As I mentioned, my area has been education or quality education, and even once you've established goals, strategies can really be misaligned. I had a very personal experience, a profoundly interesting one with the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, which is you know, a very admirable and wonderful organization. I worked there for several years, and prior to my time working there, they had one of the founders had come up with an idea that was translated by one of the senior program officers into this idea that they would identify people with essentially the science gene, or a capacity to engage in scientific pursuits that was sort of innate, and the emphasis of that initiative was building tests to find find promising young scientists at, you know, at even a preschool or early elementary age. And it was extremely contentious in the field. Many researchers loved the idea that they would get a lot of money to find activated learners in the science field, and a whole other contingent of researchers said, why are we trying to locate people who may have some special interest in science when pretty much every kid has an interest in science? Almost every kid has interest in the natural world. Almost every kid is curious. Well, every child is curious. I will just make that blanket statement. And the fighting was intense in the field of people who cared about good science experiences for children, mostly children who didn't have good science in school. For a lot of reasons in the US, science in public schools was not very good, and especially for underserved students. So in pursuit of equity in the space of science learning and science experience in schools, we had two very different camps. One that was, I'd say, mostly interested in the funding that the donor was willing to give for creating and administering these sort of tests around who's science activated. And this other group of people who said, why don't we just create environments where all children who are curiosity driven, which is, you know, kind of the way the world children are built, they have supports to do that. And in the end, the person who's running that initiative now at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, who's a friend and colleague of mine, has sort of won out. She was hired by this person who was looking more at testing kids, and recreated the initiative such that she's really building tools and opportunities for children worldwide to engage their natural curiosity to learn science, not just in schools, but out of schools through many different kinds of tools. And what you're seeing pictured here, I believe, is something called Foldscope, which Stanford engineer built, that allows for very powerful microscopes built from $1 worth of supplies that a child with some support can fold into a powerful microscope. So I gave a fairly long example of how strategy can be so radically different even when goals are similar. The next thing that needs to be aligned once you've got your goals and your strategy all set is the implementation. And implementation is a place where I think funders really miss the mark on trying to understand the complexities of implementation. I think nonprofits understand that. I think they understand it implicitly, and they understand it intuitively, and they understand it practically every day, that implementation is complex, and it's complex not just because they're trying to solve complex problems, but because conditions are continually changing in the world. Conditions, whether they're inputs like the amount of funding that a nonprofit may have, or whether they're broader social changes, whether they're changes in technology. You're doing youth development work, and all the youth were interested in the hands-on work in a maker space or a maker lab, and being together physically. And then you have social media affecting the motivation and the desire of youth to get together physically. You know, certainly one of the big disruptors will be AI. And then you also have broader, even more meta or macro changes in society, like we see with some of the moves towards greater autocracy in the world, less democratic norms that can really affect all the way down to how you are trying to address housing insecurity, or you know, certainly educational change would fall into that. So implementation, I have been part of way too many donor driven vision moments where change is linear, change is can be determined a priori, but it's also fairly easy once you find the magic bullet. And we all know that systems are complex, and there is probably very little meaningful social change, especially when we're not intervening, in a narrow sense on, say, a health problem or a environmental problem can be defined very, very narrowly, like putting up mosquito nets to avoid malarial transmission. There's very little that isn't part of complex systems, and understanding of complexity sciences is sort of critical for solid implementation, good implementation in the nonprofit sector. I think, in my experience of the world, I'm not as youthful and sharp-witted as Micah, but I have all that, that kind of embodied sense of life from working in the nonprofit sector for my entire career. Most nonprofit workers that have dedicated themselves to it have a lot of the insights about the complexity of the systems they work in, sort of built almost as a muscle memory, certainly built into what we might call intuition, which is really, the wonderful work our not just our minds do, but our social interactions allow us to do, that creates these deeply intuitive is the word I keep using, but kind of almost a knee-jerk set of insights about what will and what won't work, and why that's the case because of the complexity of social systems. And what I have discovered is very, very often that understanding of systemic complexity that can be and is often, sort of understood in a deep way by nonprofit sector workers, needs to be communicated back to donors, needs to be communicated back to people like Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, who thought they had a simple fix for educational challenges in the US, in the examples we've discussed. And I think that's an important piece that doesn't get discussed much. And there's an educative function that has to flow in the direction from nonprofits and nonprofit leaders and their research partners and colleagues back to donors, done, with all the discretion that needs to be done. But that doesn't happen enough, in my experience. And that it's not a one-off. It's a constant process of iteration, that we are always, if there's a problem that hasn't been solved, by definition, the approach has to be innovative, right? Because nobody's figured out how to do it. They've either not figured out how to solve the problem itself, like the problem of housing insecurity in this country, in the US, or they haven't figured out how to build the social will or the political will to address the problem in ways that could solve it. And so often when we start a project or an initiative, or when a donor thinks that they can make a big difference, like Mark Zuckerberg in Newark, we think, okay, will this work? Will it work the way I've strategized it? And the honest answer is typically that we don't really know. We have to try. And as we try, we have to keep our eyes and ears very, very open as to what kinds of feedbacks are coming to us in these iterative loops. So donor and leader, donor and person actually doing the work, of which I think most of you are people actually doing the work on the ground, need to be in conversation about these iterations of attempting things. We've seen the cycle. A lot of us have seen, you plan, do, test, and reflect, or there's many versions of that that cycle that feeds into the iteration, but it's trying things and then figuring out if they've worked or not. Beyond implementation, we've talked about evaluation and understanding, what is happening with the attempted interventions or attempts at social change. And using the education example, because Micah certainly brought that up, but I also have more experience in that space than any other. A lot of emphasis has been on understanding if inputs to teacher practice, teacher professional development, teacher training, if that's really where you should measure. Should you measure how well teachers are performing, or should you measure student outputs on student outcomes on tests as a measure of teacher performance? And what we've seen in many, many instances is that there are too many other social conditions affecting children to use children test scores as an outcome measure for teacher performance. And also, test scores can be a very poor indicator of what the climate and what the quality of classroom instruction is, because test scores tend to measure something fairly narrow for all kinds of social reasons. And Micah was mentioning the work of his colleague. Why can't I think of Aaron's last name right now? But anyway,
Horvath,
his colleague.
yeah.
Thank you, Aaron Horvath. Just brain moment. And really, what I think a more sophisticated, more interesting, and more meaningful target of measurement for educational change in a school, just using that as an example, would be the classroom climate. How safe do children feel? How much do they have agency to explore ideas that are meaningful to them? How much does that allow them to engage with content in ways that matter to them, that are relevant to their lives, and that inspire them to be active learners, to be engaged with the content, to be interested in school and interested in the experience of school? That probably is a better measurement. And how does that get measured? It probably gets measured through observations and mechanisms that don't devolve down to simple test scores, to simple paper and pencil kinds of studies. Then how do you do it? You can do it. I was just mentioning observations. You can do it through focus groups. You can do it through through tried and true measures of like health outcomes. You can do it through personal response, through there's a standard term for that, through actually soliciting input from participants, from people who would be beneficiaries, self-report. That's the term I'm looking for. But in fact, there are increasingly creative ways of studying causality, trying to understand what the pathways of causality are, largely because the gold standard for outcome that have been touted for maybe the last 20, 30, 40, maybe 50 years, the randomized control trial, which is a truly experimental way of studying outcomes, where you randomly assign the targets of the intervention to different kinds of treatment, a control treatment and an intervention treatment, as it were, the work of the nonprofit, basically. Those are just very hard to do. They often rely on narrow measures that are not really well aligned with the outcomes, can be really misaligned with outcomes. They're very expensive. They're hard to organize. And, maybe more than anything, it's very hard to assign people to a control and an intervention group in many, many cases. If you think about health outcomes, that could be unethical. If you think about educational outcomes, that can also be unethical. So we need better. We need to do better than just assume that if we don't have randomized controlled trial outcomes, we don't really know whether something is working or not. I've been part of movements in the education space where we ask teachers, how do you know it's working? How do you know it when you see it? And really just using the highly experienced professional who has that professional vision of a good quality outcome to be basically an instrument of calling it as effective, because they can see that the thing is effective. They can see that children are engaged. They can hear in the children's discourse over the course of a few months that the child is more sophisticated in their analysis, better at all sorts of things. And there's so much that can be relied upon in that way. It's not the only answer, but it's one of the answers in the educational system. Takes us to the idea of knowledges and what kinds of knowledges do a donor and a nonprofit need to kind of bring into that space of common ground, that space of commonality between the two of them, between the, I'm going to just say two, although there may be many stakeholders and parties involved in the conversation. And I think what we are dealing with here is in, for the purposes of strategy and decision making, there are probably three big buckets of knowledges, which is an awkward word in English, but I think it's the right word for the purposes of this analysis. There's expert knowledge, which is academic scholarship research that I'll talk a little bit more about. There's practical knowledge, and that's the tested models and the lessons learned in the field where people have tried to make change, whether they've tried to improve educational systems or increase housing for people who are housing insecure, or shift public health initiatives such that we reduce obesity and change the obesogenic kind of food system that we live in. These are things that many different nonprofits have worked on, many different donors have tried to fund, and we're absolutely at a moment, I believe, where we need greater mutual understanding or shared understanding across efforts to make a difference. And then there's the lived experience, the grounded experience and wisdom of people in communities that know what they need, know what they want, are capable of architecting their own future, of building, not just building a vision for what needs to change in their communities, but thinking about some of the structural changes that could happen. So a little more in depth, this expert academic scholarship knowledge research that can be a point of commonality and coming together between donors and nonprofits, that can build trust and increase the faith that the donor has in the nonprofit. One of the kinds of knowledge that can inform this work that I think is underused in many, many instances, probably across the philanthropic landscape, and I've seen it in organizations that absolutely have the resources to do a better job at bringing in academic expert knowledge, is that some of the qualities of this is that they're going to be foundational insights. These foundational insights are going to be, the robust and rigorous research that comes from an academic department, an academic program that may have decades of findings in it. But a lot of foundational research, as we know, is application agnostic. It's unspecific. It isn't designed to inform applied work. It's designed to describe phenomena in the world without necessarily being oriented to making the world better. It is understanding human behavior, understanding psychological processes, understanding sociological processes, understanding culture, and then, understanding many, many things that are, that are fundamentally scientific even, um, understanding how institutions work, but not thinking about how that would make the world a better place. And that's kind of a characteristic of basic research. So it needs to be translated. It needs to be made applicable. That relevance needs to be made clear, because the relevance often of any kind of academic foundational research can be unclear. And then there are mixed results and contradictions that need to be reconciled, dealt with in applying academic research to social change. And these are difficult to reconcile and aggregate, these studies, and it takes a special kind of applied research plus practice view to really make that kind of change. But I think to the extent that nonprofits and donors are looking at expert knowledge, it certainly can build, again, common ground, a common language and discourse for them to create deeper relationships, and relationships that have knowledge that can be mobilized to strategize the work that they're trying to do, and make for better decisions along the way in that iterative cycle when decisions are going to have to be made about what seems to be working and what's not working. Then the practical knowledge I alluded to before. I've been I've been part of foundation initiatives that have said, okay, all you mega foundations, all the Gateses and, and Chan Zuckerbergs and Hewletts and Packards and everybody else under the sun, let's share our failures. Let's not just share our successes. And they've made the agreement that they're going to do this, and then even the initiating foundations get scared and get cold feet and don't share their failures, because a lot of donors and a lot of foundations are very, very sensitive to their brand and how their brand is seen, and the kind of respect that they have in the field, how they reflect on the founders' legacy. A lot of it is the founder's legacy is something to be protected and cared for, and because of that, there's a real lack of systems for sharing tested models, where tested models and lessons learned from tested models may be one of the most important sources of not creating the wheel, not making the same mistakes. And I think we're at a moment historically with the advent of large language models and, artificial intelligence more generally, where there's going to be more difficulty in hiding what has and hasn't worked. I mean, the Zuckerberg foray into public schools in Newark and the Gates Foundation failures in education, a lot of the reveal there was through journalists and through sort of less systematic, more accidental revelations than through the willingness of funders to share what they have failed at, to share what they know, and to do that in a collaborative way with the nonprofits that they charged to execute on their vision in many cases. So that's, I think, a really important part of knowledge that can be, again, made in the common problem space, the common ground where donors and nonprofits are working and can build a stronger relationship. And then finally, the lived experience of people who are being served, constituents, communities, beneficiaries. We have to learn from them. There are just, innumerable cases of where the wisdom that is on the ground is a necessary input into, if I may, the kind of the donor nonprofit system that of knowledge and insight and understanding that has to be there. But as Micah alluded to, who speaks for the community? Who speaks for the beneficiaries? We have, again, a lot of historical examples of misguided assumptions about who speaks for the community. And one of my favorite is when the U.S. Invaded Iraq on the presumption that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11, which he most certainly did not really. We relied on an informant, Ahmed Chalabi, who said, "Oh yeah, when the U.S. invades Iraq, the people of Iraq are going to be lining the streets with roses for the American military, and it's going to be just a slam dunk win." But instead, we saw we've seen decades of continuing strife because of lots of social conditions in Iraq that were ignored, if not understood. And ultimately, there's still this issue of paternalism, of a power imbalance between, of course, philanthropists and beneficiaries, philanthropists and nonprofits, and there's a need in recognizing grounded experience, wisdom on the ground, to recognize that enough so that it moderates or overcomes much of the paternalistic thinking that we see is a problem of the hierarchy, the power imbalance in philanthropic practice. I'm going to speed up just a little bit because we're coming to the end of, I think, the time where I would be speaking, and then we want to leave plenty of time for answers to questions, but there are a few more points to make. And the third area that I started off with saying that where donors and nonprofits can really build relationship is in understanding outcomes, understanding results along that iterative process chain that I had mentioned before. I mentioned, understanding the what should be measured. We talked about this example of schools and then how to measure it. That's part of it. And then understanding these iterative cycles. When do we ask questions about how it might work, if it's working at all? How do we make it work better? What may work for more people, maybe in a more sustained way for longer term? These are questions that will be answered differently depending on which cycle of iteration is being tested and where the information, the feedback is coming. A lot of times we talk about results chains. That is, what are some results or indicators that we can see early on that let us know if we're on course or not when we're testing a new approach. What did Mark Zuckerberg fail to look at in the early stages of the Newark, New Jersey, massive school change to charter schools when community members were saying, "Hey, what the heck is happening?" Was that listened to? Probably not. When community members were saying, "We don't want our public neighborhood schools taken apart in favor of charter schools where kids get sorted and not every kid gets to go to the same school, and we don't have universal inclusion because charter schools get specialized." Was that being listened to? So there are many, many stages at which evaluation takes place. There's, we sometimes talk about evaluation in the development or the design stage of a project. Are you thinking about the kinds of knowledge that could be relevant? Early stage formative evaluation, where you're building the project and you're evaluating, again, along the way, what kind of indicators, what kinds of feedback are you getting from the system in which you're working to know if you're on track? And if that feedback doesn't look good, do you have the courage to change direction? And then the summative evaluation is really, okay, we've done the thing. We think we've gotten it right. We think we got to the goal, more or less. Can we really measure that fairly robustly with some kind of probably experimental or quasi-experimental design to really understand the counterfactual, if we hadn't done this, if we hadn't taken this step in this initiative to build this initiative, if we hadn't created this initiative, would we have this outcome that we think is a good outcome? So the last kind of section of what I want to say about building relationships between donors and nonprofits is just some leverage points and some, key places where I think a shared understanding, trying to come to some mutual insights about the space that you're trying to work in is really critical. Collaboration is essential. That collaboration, includes donors plus providers, donors plus communities, donors plus constituents. It also has an element that has to be paid attention to, and that's research plus practice, because a lot of times what's missing in the implementation phase is an understanding of the implementation, of the practice, and there are traditions of implementation research, that is, research on the implementation phase of a project or of an initiative. And research on the implementation phase is a lot like evaluation, but it's also using principles that come from healthcare and education and some other fields where it's been developed fairly well. And there are strategies for that some research communities apply. I've talked about co-creation. There's co-creation of strategy. There's co-creation of knowledge. But between a donor and the other stakeholders, including the nonprofit, that mutuality depends on some willingness to co-create. And then coordination. Most donors really care a lot about scale, and I don't know why it shouldn't say coordination there. That's a mistake. But for mutuality, scale oftentimes means that more stakeholders are invited, more funders are invited. There's collaborative funding. There's sharing of insights and knowledge between nonprofit operations, and combining resources collectively also can make for less strong donor influence on outcomes for a nonprofit, because no donor gets to claim that they're going to shape the space. In my last 5 minutes before we move to questions, I'm going to say that I don't mean to suggest through this discussion that big infrastructure needs to be built, that a bunch of advisors and talking heads need to be, that donors or nonprofits should be overly influenced by researchers or other consultant types who can help them. And I certainly don't mean to suggest that we need overly messy, thorny, convoluted looks at systems. But I do think we want to, be well informed, be mutually inspired, be willing to work together in a collaborative way, be committed to the relationship, and I think that commitment to the relationship and working through the challenges of the relationship, which here is symbolized by the ring of people holding hands, is really critical. And then ultimately committed also to the use of common resources and tools, which of course is being enhanced greatly by AI right now. There's just a lot more access to resources and tools. I mentioned trust early on, and trust is an aspect and an outcome of the relationship. It should be something that gets built through relationships. That how we deepen our relationships with partners, with funders, is the mechanism through which we gain trust. And that once you've built a stronger relationship, you have created ultimately better outcomes. And I think that's a statement that I'll stand behind, that these strong relationships where there's mutuality of insight, of ideas, of approaches, of understanding, of examining the work being done on the ground, that creates better strategies, that creates better decisions at critical decision points. And that's a stronger way of achieving mutual goals, which means that there has to be communication, transparency between funders and nonprofits. So for entrepreneurial donors, what does it take for nonprofits and donors to build meaningful, enduring relationships, especially when donors are entrepreneurial, fast-moving, and values-driven? I'd say as a summary slide, starting with values that lead to goals, that help develop strategies, need to use multiple sources of knowledge, learn along the cycles of implementation, iterating and keeping an eye on outcomes, both very short-term results and ultimate outcomes, and adjusting as much as is needed, and then evaluating results along the way at micro and macro levels of outcomes to improve the efforts and make better decisions. That's the summary. And we sort of promised a tool, at least. I think a framework is effectively a tool, and I hope there's something of a framework in all the words I've thrown out. But I want to call your attention to an online course, developing a strategy for social change, that our faculty lead in the group that Mike and I are part of, created with the business school at Stanford, that actually has a lot of elements of what we consider kind of the core to effective philanthropic practice. It's kind of that: be strategic. Your strategies are going to change. You're going to learn from your implementation, but the main thing you want to have at hand as a common resource, as common ground, as a common reference point between donors on the one hand and nonprofits on the other is a theory of change. And many of you have worked with theories of change, and many of you know them very well. I really like the template that Paul Brest created for this course. It's very simple, and it emphasizes that there are things that can be done on the part of the initiator, the nonprofit. There are behaviors that others are going to have to do that you're going to rely on. You're going to have to be aware of what you might have to do differently if your assumption about what behaviors other people will or won't do don't come true, and ultimately you're working towards that goal. I think it's a really good template for a theory of change. And I've worked with dozens of templates for theories of change over my career, and this is my favorite, not because I work with Paul or for Paul, but because I think it's just smart. And you can get that course. We'll send the link to it. It's, you can dabble in it. It's very user-friendly. It's long, it's complicated, but it has a lot of really good resources built into it. And all I want to close with, I'm almost on time, is to say that even in these polarized and polarizing times, something everyone, all stakeholders can agree on is that no one wants to waste money. No one wants to waste money or other resources and time. And in parallel or corollary of that is everyone wants results. We all care about making the world a better place, housing the unhoused, feeding the hungry, educating, those who have not had the opportunities that the wealthier or the more well-served have. So we all want results. We all want, in the process of achieving those results, we want respect. And the best way forward is together. And that's why this is the topic of the moment, is that we really think about the mutuality that we need to engage, we need to activate for good outcomes. And that's the end of me talking. And I hope that, Micah, you're still here. I hope you help answer the questions, because I have so much faith in what you would say.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Professor Vera, and also Micah for staying up in such a early time at night. I think it's around 4 or 3 p.m., 3 a.m. at San Francisco, if I'm right. Yep. And I think the lecture was insightful on the sense that when you engage with donor relationship, whether it's entrepreneur or not, it's very important to make an alignment in the first step when you're like making a product or a project which is impactful to society. So I think it would be good if I can like introduce you some questions related to the Korean context. So that might be helpful for people to understand. So would that be good?
Yes, please. And
Mhm,
again,
mhm,
I'm not the only person that will have opinions. So if anybody else would like to chime in,
mhm.
whether it's you, Daniel, or Micah, or any of your colleagues. Okay, please.
Great. So the first question would be from a person from a university. So in Korea, many universities lean on alumni segments. From your experience, how do we frame the ask for entrepreneur alumni to to donate in a better mindset, not just for nostalgia? And do you have any examples for in cases of universities where entrepreneur donors give?
Yeah, I think aligned with what Micah was saying about the way entrepreneurial donors think, they really do care um, about breakthrough innovations. And one of the best examples is what I mentioned earlier, the Doerr School of Sustainability. John Doerr gave, I think, $1.1 billion to Stanford to create a school of sustainability that would integrate sustainability sciences, earth sciences, and geological sciences and planetary sciences, alongside the social sciences that affect and would affect implementation strategies. Typically, the social sciences don't get given as much weight in the processes, but we know a lot about what needs to happen. We know a lot about what needs to happen scientifically for sustainability, but we haven't necessarily aligned that with our social scientific understanding of how to build awareness, make change, bridge polarized views of what's happening with the climate. And so the vision there was to create something that's filling a gap. And I think even though my group strongly advocates giving unrestricted funds and multi-year funds, a project that aligns with the values and aligns with the concerns of the ultra high net worth that can be suggested or tap into some of their personal passions certainly could mobilize more funds into the um, alumni giving space.
Great. So I think the second question would be also related to the Korean context. So many self-made founders in Korea prefer immediate relief because they themselves has been living in difficult conditions in the past. So how can you persuade them to give a more structural bet?
I really love that question, and it's been plaguing my mind too, because and this is like the really interesting data point. I believe that direct cash giving to people who lack funds has proven to have a structural effect in the longer run, because people are able to start building wealth through investing in their children's education or their, a small business or other things. So there's a real tension between, I think, the kinds of outcomes that come from relief and aid and charity in the traditional charity sense and structural change. It's not that it's either one or the other. They can be very complementary. And I would absolutely love Micah to say something about this if you would, because I think you may have some insights into that question. I don't see you coming off
Uh,
mute.
yeah,
You did.
I I'm not sure. I was actually thinking along similar lines as you, in that one of the, I guess I have Silicon Valley on the brain, but one of the sort of development of Silicon Valley philanthropy was not so much a fixation on trying to change structures, but actually thinking about how to do relief well, and finding surprisingly that had structural consequences. So I think the example Vera is mentioning is unconditional cash transfers, which, if you were to recall, like Carnegie and Rockefeller, they would have thought, oh, why would you do that? It's a waste of money. You're just giving money. You don't even know how the person's going to use it. But what a lot of the effective altruists who were behind some of these unconditional cash transfer programs found was that actually, if you just give people money, they tend to use it pretty well and improve their circumstances. I think there's a bit more controversy about some of the research findings now, and some of the people in that effective altruist community who were unconditionally in support of unconditional cash transfers are now a little bit more divided. But nevertheless, I think the findings are really interesting, actually defy a lot of the earlier sentiment about philanthropy from the Carnegie and Rockefeller era. And I guess I'm just trying to go back to Silicon Valley over and over again, but that is sort of something that comes out of that sort of focus on what actually achieves consequences, not what we idealistically think will happen. So maybe you think that structural change will happen only if you engage all these social movements and do policy advocacy. But maybe it's as simple as actually just giving people money, and you just need to do the research to see what kind of consequence that has. So being open to, the unexpected, I think, is I'm losing the track there, and I hope you're able to intercede on my behalf. But
yeah. Absolutely, you had it. And I think even something like mosquito nets to decrease the incidence of malaria, you're improving the economy of the community when you have more people who aren't sick or who aren't trying to take care of their sick children. So the systemic impacts are complicated, and that's one reason that we emphasize an understanding of systems, but it doesn't mean that you're always changing the system at a structural level. You may be changing the system by intervening at a relief level. So that's not a very helpful answer, because it didn't give an answer to the question of how do you convince donors to work systemically, to work structurally. I would replace structurally with work systemically by finding an intervention that may look like relief, but in fact has broader consequences.
Yeah.
Great. So I think trying in a very different way, like being open, is kind of important for entrepreneur donors to kind of like make change, if that's correct. And so moving on to the next question, actually, I think a lot of participants are from smaller organizations, and many of them are curious about how to actually engage with entrepreneur donors. So the next question will be related to that. So I'll go to the next question. So for small place-based organization, those without even a formal status, what actually gets the cold mail opened and short calls booked? And when the door cracks open, what's the minimum information that we have to give to entrepreneur donors to have a room for a seat or to have a conversation?
I think that's a brilliant question as well. And I'd say there are two things that come up again and again. Do you have a good story? And do you have a good statistic? Do you have a good data point? And I've worked with so many funders who have emphasized the one or the other in their search for good opportunities to fund at different times. A compelling short story with a sympathetic character, a sympathetic figure, a sympathetic person, gets a lot of attention, as does a compelling data point. We improved outcomes in this particular area by 20% in 2 years. I do think one or the other is typically what donors are looking for, and will maybe pay attention to. I think in the US, with almost 2 million nonprofits, many of which have duplicative missions, I think the use of technology, and especially AI, is going to lead to a consolidation of some of those nonprofits and allow them to use their resources to get to attract attention from donors more effectively. There may be a third attention getter besides a good story and besides data points, and that is a really compelling idea for how to change the world. And getting any of these through communication channels when everybody's inundated with more ideas, information, images, content than ever before, obviously, is the challenge. But that is that's the trick. I think collective action and looking at collectives of donors and looking at collectives of nonprofits is also a really critical move at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very insightful. I think in Korea we also see a surge of products which use AI to like impact the measurements and make a good narrative and also a solution. So maybe it's a world trend. So I think the next question would be about how to deal with CSR and government, because we have been talking with entrepreneur donors right now. But in Korea, a lot of organizations are working for government funding and also for CSR funding. So if they have limited resources, what would be like a key breakthrough point they can earn the money or the funds?
Yeah, I have found that in government and CSR, giving those statistics of outcomes are more influential than stories. And it's hard to come up with the eye-catching statistic or the eye-catching outcome that really represents the project or the program or the nonprofit accurately, but also is strong enough to claim impact. And that's kind of an art. When I work as an evaluator and have worked as an evaluator, a lot of organizations don't want to collect certain kind of information. You don't want to spend the time. You've got such limited resources to do the work that you care about doing. And why should you be, spending the time to, kind of collect data and try to analyze it in a way that pleases a funder rather than helps you do the work better? My group, our group, Micah's and my group, we say the data collected, the research that's done, the evaluation that's done on the nonprofit's efforts should always prioritize improving the work of the nonprofit. But that kind of data sometimes is not what a CSR or governmental agency is looking for. They're looking for something that seems more concrete, more black and white, more more obvious to take to the legislature or the or the business development wing of the CSR group or whatever. So finding something that is cost efficient as far as collecting data and speaks to the interests of those funders takes some real thought and some work. And we've found it in many instances, but it's not always obvious.
Mm. Yeah, and following up to that question, there's one question pretty interesting also. So I'll read it. In contexts like Korea, where evaluation is often shaped by funders' reporting requirement, what approaches can help ensure the evaluation process still strengthen alignment among values, goal, and implementation?
That's a great question. And I think working through a theory of change with the funder, including the template that I showed, and then noting that the theory of change may change over time. It's developmental. It has it's a theory. in that it's a candidate idea of how to make the world better, and you don't know until you try it whether it will work or not. Using that as a common grounding, a common anchor point, a common reference, common reference for the funder and the nonprofit, that where the goals are present in the conversation and the strategies being taken are mutually agreed upon to a certain point. Using that to drive the evaluation is the best technique I have seen.
Great. So a clear logic model.
Yeah.
And I think we'll go to the final question. So this was also interesting. So when we do partnerships, there's time where the partnership kind of like wobble away. So what's the most common failure that you've seen between entrepreneur donors and nonprofits? And what's the one safeguard that can prevent it from happening?
That's really a great question. And Micah, I want you to chime in on this too. I think losing sight of the vision, and the vision comes from the values and the goals, and the mess of implementation, the challenges of implementation. If it just seems like the goals are getting lost because implementation is so hard and so messy, and there needs often to be regrouping. Okay, we can't achieve that goal. What's a more intermediate goal? What's a more realistic goal that we can achieve? Being willing to regroup and retrench to achieve a realistic goal that keeps the attention of the entrepreneurial donor and also aligns with the mission of the nonprofit is something that can keep alignment and keep that relationship. Because if the goal looks like, that's not going to work, we're not getting there, I'm going to go, the donor loses interest and thinks, okay, I'm going to consider that a loss where I invested, and I'm going to go find something better. But the reality is, oftentimes, very, very often, that original vision and goal is not naturally or not realistically achievable. So being willing to reconsider and retrench is a really brave move for both the nonprofit and the entrepreneurial donor. And Micah, do you have anything you want to add in our last 30 seconds?
Yeah, maybe I can say something that also relates to an earlier question about how to engage with entrepreneurial donors. I think one thing that is often true is that a lot of entrepreneurs who are engaging in philanthropy have probably made a lot of money and are now looking for some other purpose to define their life. Maybe, they cashed out, or they had a really successful initial public offering, and now they're trying to figure out how to sort of think about their sort of lasting purpose in the world. Like how are they a valuable person? And so a lot of times I think there's research that indicates that if you want to sustain an entrepreneur in your work as a funder, you want to think about how can you convince them that participating in your project is allowing them to have some kind of legacy. Like how are they building an identity that's going to go forward and prove that they had some kind of impact on the world? And one way of thinking about that is, connecting their sort of personal life and their experiences with the sort of lasting impact that you're going to try and have in your nonprofit organization. If you're working on science related funding and you find that the entrepreneur has that was an important element of their own upbringing, being able to say, hey, you're going to be able to have this as your legacy, something that was important to you, to your identity, is going to endure. Your life doesn't just end because you're a successful entrepreneur. You still have value in the world. I guess it sounds a little cheesy, but I do think that's actually a real legitimate concern of a lot of entrepreneurs, that after they're successful, they don't even have an identity of value anymore. So being able to really think about how you can prove to them that participating in your work actually allows them to extend their legacy into the future and they still have value is one way of thinking about it. I know it's really vague, but if if you follow up with me, I can maybe send you some of the research that's on this topic.
I think that's a very insightful and very appropriate ending, is that, you know, the relationship between the funder and the people who are realizing the funder's vision is really about caring to make a difference in the world, and having actually made that difference, being an instrument for changing the world, being a cause for social change. And that mutuality, and you know, I love the word mutuality, is really going to be critical to any appeal. Thank you for that, Micah.
Yeah, and just one last question about it's about the ecosystem part actually. And is there any organic or social spaces in Silicon Valley or in San Francisco who kind of like bridge the funders and the small organizations? Because small organizations often tend to have difficulties finding the right donor and to introduce their ideas. So one curiosity about that.
Yeah, you know, community foundations like the Silicon Valley Community Foundation that Micah mentioned should have that responsibility. They should be understanding the ecosystem that they're in, and helping bridge from donors into or to the smaller nonprofits that the donors don't have time and space to really understand and investigate. PACs, we work more on helping donors think about actually taking the step to identify the smaller nonprofits. We encourage them to use, you know, a variety of tools, including the rating agencies and the foundation aggregators, you know, the online resources, and we encourage them to talk to other organizations like community foundations that do know the communities. So we're part of that ecosystem, I'd say, but it's a critical question, because for a very small organization that doesn't have a web presence and doesn't have a technology presence, I think there are challenges, and there are collectives and collaboratives, both of funders and of nonprofits. There are the community foundations, and there are the intermediary organizations like Stanford PACs that do try to encourage creative investigation of who is worth funding, even if they don't have much of a presence or much of a track record. Because sometimes a brand new, you know, nonprofit is or a brand new social initiative may be really, you know, insightful and really worth funding. So it's a complex ecosystem, but one that exists, probably will exist better as people use AI tools more intelligently and more effectively.
Great.
I would just add,
Sure.
if there's time, can I add one more?
Sure. Of course.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would also add that I think that's a really challenging task, trying to get funders to recognize smaller organizations. But something that's interesting that Daniel suggested I was going to talk about, which I disappointed him by not talking about, is this habit of participatory funding. And one organization in the Bay Area, because you asked about Silicon Valley, that's actually trying to harness the knowledge of people who might actually know more about smaller organizations is an organization called Magic Cabinet. And what they do is they actually get nonprofit organizations together within San Francisco and in Seattle, and they give them a lump sum of money, and then they allow the nonprofit organizations to allocate that money themselves. So that's one way in which they've actually been able to channel money to smaller organizations, because those nonprofits tend to actually know who's doing good work within their community better sometimes than distant funders. And if they have authority over how to allocate funds, they tend to support those organizations. It's not a direct answer to your question, but I suppose it does indicate the potential value of more participatory models of philanthropy and being able to surface these kind of interesting smaller projects that might not be readily visible to sort of big donors out there. So check them out, Magic Cabinet.
Yeah. Well, I think including me, the participants would definitely think that we would like to hear more about the ecosystematic part in San Francisco. So maybe we can like do a session next time about that, because that sounds very interesting. And I think in Korea, we are also trying to make a good pipeline for nonprofits to thrive and to make more innovational projects more sustainable. So that might be our next session if that's good. And yeah, and I think it's almost time, so we'll have to wrap up the Q&A session. And if the question and for the questions which aren't answered right now, I'll try to send it to Professor Vera or Micah, so the people who are participating can have a clear answer. And I'll definitely share what we can to make this conversation ongoing. So thank you very much for your generosity and your time. I know it's like almost like 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. in San Francisco right now, and we're very, very grateful for you for participating. And I think your work made the Korean ecosystem more insightful, and listening to all of the stuff was amazing for me also. So we'll try to pay it forward, the ideas that you gave us, and we'll try to spread them more. Thanks.